Hi everyone, it's time for another how to write a creepypasta or horror story video. If you haven't watched any of the previous videos, please do. I'll leave a link down below to the playlist. And in this video we're going to talk about how do you make a story frightening? How do you scare your reader? This also applies to filmmakers. How do you scare your audience? And there's been a lot written about this. There are a lot of different techniques, there are a lot of different opinions. But essentially, from my point of view, I believe that it's about creating one of 5 feelings in your reader, essentially. This it definitely applies to the short story. When you write a novel, it becomes a little bit more complicated, simply because you get more time to work on different aspects of fear. But nonetheless, these 5 aspects of fear are still there. And it's through prodding at each one of those, or just picking one and going with that in your story, that really makes for a frightening tale. Now, before we get to those 5 aspects of fear, remember what I said in some of the previous videos. You're your best compass. No one else can tell you whether something is frightening or not. Occasionally you'll have a reader that they'll tell you something in your story was frightening and you didn't even realise that aspect of it was scary. I had that with a story called Roadkill, where there was, to me, blatantly obvious frightening things happening in that story, and then there was something much smaller that was mentioned, and a reader mentioned it and said that they couldn't get it out of their head. So sometimes you can be surprised by that, but in the end you are your own compass. So only you can tell if something is really frightening or not. If you are writing something and you don't find it scary and you want it to be scary, then the chances are it's not scary, because you have to be able to feel that fear. Okay, you might not feel it on the same level as your readers because they don't know what's happening, whereas you do. But you still want to feel that fear. And there's been loads of times where I've been writing and I've had to look over my shoulder late at night because I've creeped myself out. I've actually got frightened by stuff that I'm writing, and that might sound really, really self-involved, but I genuinely believe with any art form that's the most important thing, is that you respond to what you're doing in a certain way and hope that some other people will. I guarantee you, if you find it scary, at least one other person out there will, if not quite a lot of people. I think one of the problems with horror stories a lot of the time is that people write them and just assume that they're scary because they're like, oh, well, I'm so smart and I'm writing this horror story and this horrible thing has just happened. If you're not feeling it, chances are your audience won't feel it either. So past that, taking that as the most important thing, but putting it to the side for a second, you then can look and think, if you're having, if you're struggling to figure out how to make something frightening, you can look at it in terms of fear. Fear is one of the base emotions in any human being, and horror is really it's built on a foundation of fear for the most part. We can explore loads of other ideas, we can explore loads of other emotions, we can explore loads of other ways of thinking, but in the end, fear is what it's about. I wrote another horror story a while ago called The End of All Hallows Eve, which I enjoyed, but some people didn't enjoy it as much because they didn't find it frightening. Now that didn't bother me so much because I didn't write it to be scary, but some people had the anticipation of thinking that it was going to be frightening because they'd read some of my other stuff. But anyway, I digress. I'm getting off track and getting all muddled up. So fear. How do we make readers frightened? To me, there are 5 ways to do it, and I'm going to talk about those right now. So number 1, and to me the most important of all of them, is anticipation. Causing a sense of anticipation in your reader or the audience. anyone who's watched a Hitchcock movie will know exactly what I'm talking about. We are talking about causing suspense in the person who's enjoying the story. We want to create a feeling of foreknowledge that something is going to happen. Now, there are two ways to do that. One is to reveal something to you, the reader or the viewer, and not to a character. Hitchcock uses the example of a bomb in a restaurant in one of his films. You know the bomb's there. Was it in a restaurant or in a bus? I think it may have been in a bus. I don't know where I got restaurant from. He uses that example. You've got a bomb there, and the audience knows it's there, but some of the characters don't. And the suspense is created because you're waiting for those characters to find out about it. You're like, hurry up, find the bomb, get rid of it. That's the tension, the anticipation that's been created. So you can do that. You can reveal something to you, the audience or the reader, but not to a character, and that can create anticipation for something. However, in horror, it's normally the fear of the unknown, essentially. So most of the time, you are along for the ride. So you only know often as much as the characters in the story seem to know at that point in time. So you can create anticipation in a reader by doing what a lot of people talk about, which is foreshadowing. You can, the simplest way to foreshadow something is, maybe cliched, but it's maybe a change in the weather, where things become dark and clouded and brooding. But that's a really simplistic way of doing it. I've done that myself. I'm not saying it's wrong, but there are more complex ways to do it to create anticipation. You can use the language, you can use descriptions. What I do is I slip in words into my descriptions of leading up to an event, which are maybe slightly out of place, and I think it creates a feeling of unease in the person, and a feeling that something is going to happen. But the important aspect of anticipation is that it keeps ramping up. You can't just anticipate something at the same level for the whole time. I mean, you can't have an entire chapter of a book anticipating an event, or maybe even an entire book anticipating an event, and not have the stakes raised at any point, because the reader will get bored. Eventually they'll become desensitized to what's going to come up. Like if there's a monster behind the door somewhere, like if someone's walking down a corridor to that, a really long corridor, and the story's just going on and on and on, describing how the character's walking down that corridor to that room where there may be something. Maybe you don't know, as the audience or the reader, you don't know what's behind that door, you don't know what's in that room. You have to be able to increase the tension line by line, paragraph by paragraph, and just increase the feeling that something is going to happen. So that's anticipation. You can create fear that way. To me, it's the most important, because really it's sometimes the reveal is not as good as the mystery, and at least if you get the mystery right, if you don't get the reveal right, you don't get that correct in your writing, then the reader will at least say, well, do you know what, I really enjoyed the mystery, at least up until that point. So they still got something out of it. They still got something out of the anticipation of the reveal. So that's the first way, is anticipation in terms of fear in your reader. The second one is shock. That in cinema we have jump out scares for things like that. A lot of people think that you can't do that in literature, and okay, you can't just have something that all of a sudden jumps out of the screen with a loud noise and makes us just jump out of our seat. You can't necessarily do that, but you can still shock the reader. You can still all of a sudden put in a line which catches the reader completely off guard. That sense of shock, to me, there is an inherent fear in that, and especially after the fact, if it's not at the end of the story, because you can be uncertain about what's going to come up, what's going to happen. So you can shock the reader. That could be the simplest way to do it, would be to all of a sudden kill a character that the reader thought was there for the long haul, or to have an event take place which just seems to really jar with what's happening, or an explanation of something which is, you know, like a reveal. But you can shock the reader, and I think that can create a sense of fear as well. Just your nerves can be jangling a little bit, and sometimes you can use 1 and 2 in tandem with one another. Anticipation followed by a shock, you know, maybe anticipating one thing happening, so you get the build up of this, you know, you're feeling nervous, you're feeling frightened as this character is coming towards, you know, that empty dark room, and then something else happens, someone jumps out from behind them. You know, these are really simplistic ways that I'm describing it, but you get what I'm saying. That you can cause a shock in the reader, and that can cause an element of fear. So that's anticipation, shock, and the third is repulsion. This is the one that I see the most in the creepypasta community, and it's the one which I would suggest you try and stay away from unless you're really sure you're doing something clever with it. So repulsion can be gore, violence, it can be it can be gore or violence. It can be horrific death scenes, torture, things like that. However, you could use repulsion in another way. You could tackle something which should cause repulsion in all of us, something like child abuse, and or some sort of situation that would repulse you in some way. And I think again there's an inherent fear in that. In fact, repulsion is really what we talk about when, you know, the word horror that we use for the entire genre, really, it's really connected to that word repulsion for me. But the funny thing is, some of the greatest horror stories don't have repulsion in it. Again, you could mix up the first three. You could have the anticipation of the character going somewhere, a shock because you think you're being led one way and then something else happens, followed by the repulsion of perhaps that event being something which turns your stomach or makes you feel uncomfortable in a way. Don't, in my opinion, don't just go for the easy route, which is to just have descriptions of horrible things happening to people, really violent things, horrific descriptions. Don't get me wrong, I've used them myself, but I tend to go for something that causes real repulsion, which is maybe something physically happening to me. I wouldn't dwell on it maybe in the writing, but something physically that happens to you that is just really, it's an abhorrent thought. So that's anticipation, shock, repulsion. Looking at my list here, what was the other one? Right, again, this is a really important one, and you might connect this to the first type of fear, anticipation. This is, I was trying to come up with a word for it. I used chill at one point, but chill just sounds like people are sitting relaxing. Creeping unease. That's a phrase I use often when I'm talking about my characters and situations. They experience a creeping unease. And really what I'm talking about here is atmosphere. You know, when people watch certain old films and they say, right, well, you know, it wasn't really terrifying, it wasn't frightening, like the old Hammer horror movies and things like that. Based on today's sensibilities, it doesn't feel frightening anymore. Or maybe some of the old Universal horror movies. But there was a creeping, it felt creepy, basically. It felt creepy. There was like an atmosphere of creepiness, of something of almost foreboding, but not quite there, because This needs to be differentiated from anticipation, because as I said with anticipation, you're anticipating an event and it's always ramping up as you're getting closer and closer and closer to that event, so that you reach this crescendo of fear when the actual event happens. Creeping unease is not like that. It's just creating either a mild discomfort in the reader, which just permeates the entire story. Even when non-frightening things are happening in the story, the reader still feels like a little bit creeped out by it. You can do it that way. You can try and create this atmosphere. And I think that with Creeping Unease, what's great about it is that a lot of the time, as I said, you can watch a film, but you can read a story as well that has this creepy vibe to it and still really, really enjoy it. And that's really the other way to do it, which is that there's almost, sometimes I use this phrase, cozy horror. And what I mean by that is the feeling of a horror story that isn't going to terrify you. It isn't going to make you scared to go to sleep that night. But it just creates this warm feeling where it's just creepy enough, just go permeate, just strands of creepiness going through the story. You can imagine yourself sitting by a fire on a cold and blustery winter's night, reading this story and just feeling that creeping unease, but not enough to count as anticipation. I mean, suppose it can act as anticipation, but it's not really ramped up in the same way. It's really about vibe more than anything else. And the last, so just recap: anticipation, shock, repulsion, creeping unease. The last one is maybe a little bit debatable. I was just going to keep it to the 4, but I did think about this one, which is grief. We're all afraid of losing the people in our lives. We're all afraid of losing the people that we love, people that we care about. But if you're doing your job, if a character should be loved, then there should be a fear for the reader of something happening to that character. And really, how many times have you read a book or watched a film where you've been sitting there thinking, oh, please don't let it happen to them, and that character is put into situations where you think, no, don't go in there, don't go in there. And it's not just because you don't want the reveal of whatever horrors there, you don't want to jump out scare or anything like that. It's actually that you care about the character as well. You don't want that character to die. And there's been times when I read stories and it appears that a character's died, and then it turns out that they haven't. But when the character does die, you're kind of like, oh, I'm, really like annoyed that character has died. And there's an inherent fear in that. There's an inherent fear of grief. And again, if it's a character that you've built up so that the readers really love, then you are bringing shock into it again as well. So that, I mean, the 5 types of fear that I'm talking about all can intermingle. You can have all of them in a story. But I think that if you're worrying about finding a story, making your story frightening, then focus on what, first of all, your approach is, your feeling is to it. Are you scared by it? And then think about these 5 types of fear. And that might also, they might also act as jumping off points where you can think about, right, okay, well, maybe this story could use a bit of grief in it. How am I going to incorporate that? Or a shock. This whole story's maybe had the creeping unease, but maybe I need something else. Maybe I need a shock to sort of mix it up. Do I have enough anticipation? And I can't stress that enough. Anticipation is the main one. If you don't get any other ones right, get anticipation right. Because it's honestly, not just half the battle, it's most of the battle, making the reader feel like something is going to happen. And that's really what a page turner is all about, making the reader feel that something's happening, and they have to find out. And that's with anticipation. You ramp it up and ramp it up and ramp it up. So that's my idea anyways, to look at those 5 types of fear. There very well may be other ones. Maybe you'll all think of some. I've just realised that I've moved completely off centre as this video's went on. Maybe you'll come up with some of your own. So that's all for now. I will be back soon with some more videos. We recently hit 500 subscribers, which I'm totally chuffed about and really thankful for. I'm going to be doing some videos about that soon, some narrations and some horror gameplays and things like that. But anyway, for now, I'm going to go. Check out the Facebook page below. We just hit 1,800 likes, which is amazing, and my Patreon account, which is a way to support me if you really love my work. Okay, and maybe you don't love it. I realised how pretentious that sounded when I said that. If you really love my work, you might think it's shit. And you know what? That's okay. Some of it might be. So anyway, yeah, I'm totally milking the end of this video. So that's all for now. Go and check out the Facebook page, Twitter account, Patreon account, and I'll be back soon. I hope you're all doing really well, and if you have any thoughts about anything in this video, or you have any questions for future videos, please do leave them down below. Bye for now.